Chapter 6. Doc was collecting marine animals in the great tide pool on the tip of the peninsula. It is a fabulous place. When the tide is in, a wave-churned basin, creamy with foam, whipped by the combers that roll in from the whistling buoy on the reef. But when the tide goes out, the little water world becomes quiet and lovely. The sea is very clear, and the bottom becomes fantastic with hurrying, fighting, feeding, breeding animals. Crabs rush from frond to frond of the waving algae. Starfish squat over mussels and limpets, attach their million little suckers, and then slowly lift with incredible power until the prey is broken from the rock. And then the starfish stomach comes out and envelops its food. Orange and speckled and fluted nudibranchs slide gracefully over the rocks, their skirts waving like the dresses of Spanish dancers. And black eels poke their heads out of crevices and wait for prey. The snapping shrimps with their trigger claws pop loudly. The lovely colored world is glassed over. Hermit crabs, like frantic children, scamper on the bottom sand. And now one, finding an empty snail shell he likes better than his own, creeps out, exposing his soft body to the enemy for a moment, and then pops into the new shell. A wave breaks over the barrier and churns the glassy water for a moment and mixes bubbles into the pool, and then it clears and is tranquil and lovely and murderous again. Here, a crab tears a leg from his brother. The anemones expand like soft and brilliant flowers, inviting any tired and perplexed animal to lie for a moment in their arms. And when some small crab or little tide pool Johnny accepts the green and purple invitation, the petals whip in, the stinging cells shoot tiny narcotic needles into the prey, and it grows weak and perhaps sleepy, while the searing caustic digestive acids melt its body down. Then the creeping murderer, the octopus, steals out slowly, softly, moving like a gray mist, pretending now to be a bit of weed, now a rock, now a lump of decaying meat, while its evil goat eyes watch coldly. It oozes and flows toward a feeding crab, and as it comes close, its yellow eyes burn, and its body turns rosy with the pulsing color of anticipation and rage. Then suddenly it runs lightly on the tips of its arms as ferociously as a charging cat. It leaps savagely on the crab. There is a puff of black fluid, and the struggling mass is obscured in the sepia cloud, while the octopus murders the crab. On the exposed rocks out of the water, the barnacles bubble behind their closed doors, and the limpets dry out. And down to the rocks come the black flies to eat anything they can find. The sharp smell of iodine from the algae, and the lime smell of calcareous bodies, and the smell of powerful protein, smell of sperm and ova fill the air. On the exposed rocks, the starfish emit semen and eggs from between their rays. The smells of life and richness, of death and digestion, of decay and birth, burden the air. And salt spray blows it from the barrier, where the ocean waits for its rising strength to permit it back into this great tide pool again. And on the reef, the whistling buoy bellows like a sad and patient bull. In the pool, Doc and Hazel worked together. Hazel lived in the palace flop house with Mac and the boys. Hazel got his name in a haphazard way, as his life was ever afterward. His worried mother had 7 children in 8 years. Hazel was the 8th, and his mother became confused about his sex when he was born. She was tired and run down anyway from trying to feed her 7 children and their father. She had tried every possible way of making money. Paper flowers, mushrooms at home, rabbits for meat and fur, while her husband from a canvas chair gave her every help his advice and reasoning and criticism could offer. She had a great aunt named Hazel who was reputed to carry life insurance. The 8th child was named Hazel before the mother got it through her head that Hazel was a boy, and by that time she was used to the name and never bothered to change it. Hazel grew up, did 4 years in grammar school, 4 years in reform school, and didn't learn anything in either place. Reform schools are supposed to teach viciousness and criminality, but Hazel didn't pay enough attention. He came out of reform school as innocent of viciousness as he was of fractions and long division. Hazel loved to hear conversation, but he didn't listen to words, just the tone of the conversation. He asked questions, not to hear the answers, but simply to continue the flow. He was 26, dark-haired and pleasant, strong, willing, and loyal. Quite often he went collecting with Doc, and he was very good at it once he knew what he wanted. His fingers could creep like an octopus, could grab and hold like an anemone. He was sure-footed on the slippery rocks, and he loved the hunt. Doc wore his rain hat and high rubber boots as he worked, but Hazel sloshed about in tennis shoes and blue jeans. They were collecting starfish. Doc had an order for 300. Hazel picked a knobby purplish starfish from the bottom of the pool and popped it into his nearly full gunny sack. I wonder what they do with them, he said. Do with what? Doc asked. The starfish, said Hazel. You sell 'em. You'll send out a barrel of 'em. What do the guys do with them? You can't eat 'em. They study them, said Doc patiently, and he remembered that he had answered his question for Hazel dozens of times before. But Doc had one mental habit he could not get over. When anyone asked a question, Doc thought he wanted to know the answer. That was the way with Doc. He never asked unless he wanted to know, and he could not conceive of the brain that would ask without wanting to know. But Hazel, who simply wanted to hear talk, had developed a system of making the answer to one question the basis of another. It kept conversation going. What do they find to study? Hazel continued. They're just starfish. There's millions of them around. I can get you 1,000,000 of them. They're complicated and interesting animals, Doc said a little defensively. Besides, these are going to the Middle West to Northwestern University. Hazel used his trick. They got no starfish there? They got no ocean there, said Doc. Oh, said Hazel, and he cast frantically about for a peg to hang a new question on. He hated to have a conversation die out like this. He wasn't quick enough. While he was looking for a question, Doc asked one. Hazel hated that. It meant casting about in his mind for an answer, and casting about in Hazel's mind was like wandering alone in a deserted museum. Hazel's mind was choked with uncatalogued exhibits. He never forgot anything, but he never bothered to arrange his memories. Everything was thrown together like fishing tackle in the bottom of a rowboat. Hooks and sinkers, and line and lures and gaffs all snarled up. Doc asked, How are things going up at the palace? Hazel ran his fingers through his dark hair, and he peered into the clutter of his mind. Pretty good, he said. That fellow Gay is moving in with us, I guess. His wife hits him pretty bad. He don't mind that when he's awake, but she waits till he gets to sleep and then hits him. He hates that. He has to wake up and beat her up, and then he goes back to sleep. She hits him again. He don't get any rest, so he's moving in with us. That's a new one, said Doc. She used to swear out a warrant and put him in jail. Yeah, said Hazel, but that was before they built the new jail in Salinas. Used to be 30 days, and Gay was pretty hot to get out. But this new jail, radio in the tank and good bunks, and the sheriff's a nice fellow. Gay gets in there, and he don't want to come out. He likes it so much his wife won't get him arrested anymore. So she figured out this hitting him while he's asleep. It's nerve-wracking, he says. And you know as good as me, Gay never did take any pleasure beating her up. He only done it to keep his self-respect. But he gets tired of it. I guess he'll be with us now. Doc straightened up. The waves were beginning to break over the barrier of the great tide pool. The tide was coming in, and the little rivers from the sea had begun to flow over the rocks. The wind blew freshly in from the whistling buoy, and the barking of sea lions came from around the point. Doc pushed his rain hat on the back of his head. We've got enough starfish, he said, and then went on. Look, Hazel, I know you've got 6 or 7 undersized abalones in the bottom of your sack. If we get stopped by a game warden, you're going to say they're mine, on my permit, aren't you? Well, hell, said Hazel. Look, Doc said kindly, suppose I get an order for abalones, and maybe the game warden thinks I'm using my collecting permit too often. Suppose he thinks I'm eating them. Well, hell, said Hazel. It's like the Industrial Alcohol Board. They've got suspicious minds. They always think I'm drinking the alcohol. They think that about everyone. Well, ain't you? Not much of it, said Doc. That stuff they put in tastes terrible, and it's a big job to redistill it. That stuff ain't so bad, said Hazel. Me and Mac had a snort of it the other day. What is it they put in? Doc was about to answer when he saw it was Hazel's trick again. Let's get moving, he said. He hoisted his sack of starfish on his shoulder, and he'd forgotten the eagle abalones in the bottom of Hazel's sack. Hazel followed him up out of the tide pool and up the slippery trail to solid ground. The little crabs scampered and skittered out of their way. Hazel felt that he had better cement the grave over the topic of the abalones. That painter guy came back to the palace, he offered. Yes, said Doc. Yeah, you see, he done all our pictures in chicken feathers, and now he says he got to do them all over again with nutshells. He says he changed his medium. Doc chuckled. He's still building his boat? Sure, said Hazel. He's got it all changed around. New kind of boat. I guess he'll take it apart and change it. Doc, is he nuts? Doc swung his heavy sack of starfish to the ground and stood panting a little. Nuts? He asked. Oh, yes, I guess so. Nuts about the same amount we are, only in a different way. Such a thing had never occurred to Hazel. He looked upon himself as a crystal pool of clarity, and on his life as a troubled glass of misunderstood virtue. Doc's last statement had outraged him a little. "But that boat," he cried. "He's been building that boat for 7 years that I know of. The blocks rotted out, and he made concrete blocks. Every time he gets it nearly finished, he changes it and starts over again. I think he's nuts. 7 years on a boat?" Doc was sitting on the ground, pulling off his rubber boots. "You don't understand," he said gently. "Henry loves boats, but he's afraid of the ocean." "What's he want a boat for, then?" Hazel demanded. "He likes boats," said Doc. "But suppose he finishes his boat. Once it's finished, people will say, 'Why don't you put it in the water?' Then if he puts it in the water, he'll have to go out in it, and he hates the water. So you see, he never finishes the boat, so he doesn't ever have to launch it." Hazel had followed this reasoning to a certain point, but he abandoned it before it was resolved. Not only abandoned it, but searched for some way to change the subject. "I think he's nuts," he said lamely. On the black earth on which the ice plants bloomed, hundreds of black stink bugs crawled, and many of them stuck their tails up in the air. "Look at all them stink bugs," Hazel remarked, grateful to the bugs for being there. "They're interesting," said Doc. "Well, what they got their asses up in the air for?" Doc rolled up his wool socks and put them in the rubber boots, and from his pocket he brought out dry socks and a pair of thin moccasins. "I don't know why," he said. "I looked them up recently. They're very common animals, and one of the commonest things they do is put their tails up in the air. And in all the books there isn't one mention of the fact that they put their tails up in the air, or why." Hazel turned one of the stink bugs over with the toe of his wet tennis shoe, and the shining black beetle strove madly with floundering legs to get upright again. "Well, why do you think they do it?" "I think they're praying," said Doc. "What?" Hazel was shocked. "The remarkable thing," said Doc, "isn't that they put their tails up in the air. The really incredibly remarkable thing is that we find it remarkable. We could only use ourselves as yardsticks. If we did something as inexplicable and strange, we'd probably be praying. So maybe they're praying." "Let's get the hell out of here," said Hazel. Chapter 7. The Palace Flop House has no sudden development. Indeed, when Mac and Hazel and Eddie and Huey and Jones moved into it, they looked upon it as little more than shelter from the wind and the rain, as a place to go when everything else had closed or when their welcome was thin and sere with overuse. Then the palace was only a long bare room, lit dimly by 2 small windows walled with unpainted wood, smelling strongly of fish meal. They had not loved it then, but Mac knew that some kind of organization was necessary, particularly among such a group of ravening individualists. A training army which has not been equipped with guns and artillery and tanks uses artificial guns and masquerading trucks to simulate its destructive panoply, and its toughening soldiers get used to field guns by handling logs on wheels. Mac, with a piece of chalk, drew 5 oblongs on the floor, each 7 feet long and 4 feet wide, and each square he wrote a name. There were simulated beds. Each man had property rights inviolable in his space. He could legally find a man who encroached on his square. The rest of the room was property common to all. That was in the first days when Mac and the boys sat on the floor, played cards, hunkered down, and slept on the hard boards. Perhaps, save for an accident of weather, they might always have lived that way. However, an unprecedented rainfall, which went on for a month, changed all that. House-ridden, the boys grew tired of squatting on the floor. Their eyes became outraged by the bare board walls. Because it sheltered them, the house grew dear to them, and it had the charm of never knowing the entrance of an outraged landlord. For Lee Chong never came near it. Then one afternoon, Huey came in with an army cot which had a torn canvas. He spent 2 hours sewing up the rip with fishing line, and that night the others lying on the floor in their squares watched Huey ooze gracefully into his cot. They heard him sigh with an abysmal comfort, and he was asleep and snoring before anyone else. The next day, Mac puffed up the hill carrying a rusty set of springs he had found on a scrap iron dump. The apathy was broken then. The boys outdid one another in beautifying the Palace Flop House until after a few months it was, if anything, over-furnished. There were old carpets on the floor, chairs with and without seats. Mac had a wicker chase lounge painted bright red. There were tables, a grandfather clock without dial face or works. The walls were whitewashed, which made it almost light and airy. Pictures began to appear, mostly calendars showing improbable, luscious blondes holding bottles of Coca-Cola. Henry had contributed 2 pieces from his chicken feather period. A bundle of gilded cattails stood in one corner, and a sheaf of peacock feathers was nailed to the wall, beside the grandfather clock. They were some time acquiring a stove, and when they did find what they wanted, a silver-scrolled monster with fluoriated warming ovens, and a front like a nickel-plated tulip garden, they had trouble getting it. It was too big to steal, and its owner refused to part with it to the sick widow with 8 children whom Mac invented and patronized in the same moment. The owner wanted $1.50, and didn't come down to 80 cents for 3 days. The boys closed at 80 cents and gave him an IOU, which he probably still has. The transaction took place in Seaside, and the stove weighed 300 pounds. Mac and Huey exhausted every possibility of haulage for 10 days, and only when they realized that no one was going to take the stove home for them did they begin to carry it. It took them 3 days to carry it to Cannery Row, a distance of 5 miles, and they camped beside it at night. But once installed in the palace flophouse, it was the glory and the hearth and the center. Its nickel flowers and foliage shone with a cheery light. It was the gold tooth of the palace. Fired up, it warmed the big room. Its oven was wonderful, and you could fry an egg on its shiny black lids. With the great stove came pride, and with pride, the palace became home. Eddie planted morning glories to run over the door, and Hazel acquired some rather rare fuchsia bushes planted in 5-gallon cans, which made the entrance formal and a little cluttered. Mac and the boys loved the palace, and they even cleaned it a little sometimes. In their minds, they sneered at unsettled people who had no house to go to, and occasionally, in their pride, they brought a guest home for a day or two. Eddie was understudy bartender at La Ida. He filled in with Whitney, the regular bartender, was sick, which was as often as Whitey could get away with it. Every time Eddie filled in, a few bottles disappeared, so he couldn't fill in too often. But Whitey liked to have Eddie take his place because he was convinced, and correctly, that Eddie was one man who wouldn't try to keep his job permanently. Almost anyone could have trusted Eddie to this extent. Eddie didn't have to remove much liquor. He kept a gallon jug under the bar, and in the mouth of the jug there was a funnel. Anything left in the glasses, Eddie poured into the funnel before he washed the glasses. If an argument or a song were going on at La Ida, or late at night when good fellowship had reached its logical conclusion, Eddie poured glasses half or 2/3 full into the funnel. The resulting punch which he took back to the palace was always interesting and sometimes surprising. The mixture of rye, beer, bourbon, Scotch, wine, rum, and gin was fairly constant. But now and then, some effete customer would order a stinger, or an anisette, or a curacao, and these little touches gave a distinct character to the punch. It was Eddie's habit always to shake a little angostura into the jug just before he left. On a good night, Eddie got 3/4 of a gallon. It was a sort of satisfaction to him that nobody was out anything. He had observed that a man got just as drunk on half a glass as on a whole one, that is, if he was in the mood to get drunk at all. Eddie was a very desirable inhabitant of the palace flophouse. The others never asked him to help with the housecleaning, and once Hazel washed 4 pairs of Eddie's socks. Now on the afternoon when Hazel was out collecting with Doc in the great tide pool, the boys were sitting around in the palace, sipping the result of Eddie's latest contribution. Gay was there too, the latest member of the group. Eddie sipped speculatively from his glass and smacked his lips. "It's funny how you get a run," he said. "Take last night. There was at least 10 guys ordered Manhattans. Sometimes maybe you don't get 2 calls for a Manhattan in a month. It's the grenadine gives the stuff that tastes." Mac tasted his, a big taste, and refilled his glass. "Yes," he said somberly. "It's little things make the difference." He looked about to see how this gem had set with the others. Only Gay got the full impact. "Sure is," he said. Where's Hazel today?" Mac asked. Jones said, "Hazel went out with Doc to get some starfish." Mac nodded his head soberly. "That Doc is a hell of a nice fella," he said. "He'll give you a quarter any time. When I cut myself, he put on a new bandage every day. Hell of a nice fella." The others nodded in profound agreement. "I've been wondering for a long time," Mac continued, "what we can do for him. Something nice, something he'd like." "He'd like a dame," said Huey. "He's got 3-4 dames," said Jones. "You can always tell when he pulls them from front curtains closed and when he plays that kind of church music on the phonograph." Mac said reprovingly to Huey, Just because he doesn't run no dame naked through the streets in the daytime, you think docs celebrate. What celebrate? Eddie asked. That's when you can't get no dame, said Mac. I thought it was a kind of party, said Jones. A silence fell in the room. Mac lifted in his chaise lounge. Huey let the front legs of his chair down on the floor. They looked into space, and then they all looked at Mac. Mac said, Huh. Eddie said, What kind of a party you think Doc would like? What other kind is there? Said Jones. Mac mused. Doc wouldn't like this stuff from the wine jug. How do you know? Huey demanded. You never offered him none. Oh, I know, said Mac. He's been to college. Once I seen a dame in a fur coat go in there. Never did I see her come out. It was 2:00 the last I looked, and that church music going. No, you couldn't offer him none of this. He filled his glass again. This tastes pretty nice after the third glass, Huey said loyally. No, said Mac, not for Doc. Have to be whiskey, the real thing. He likes beer, said Jones. He's all the time going over to Lee's for beer, sometimes in the middle of the night. Mac said, I figure when you buy beer, you're buying too much tar. Take 8% beer, while you're spending your dough for 92% water and color and hops and stuff like that. Eddie, he added, you think you can get 4 or 5 bottles of whiskey at La Ida next time Whitey's sick? Sure, said Eddie. Sure, I can get it. But that'd be the end. No more golden eggs. I think Johnny's suspicious anyways. Other day, he says, I smell a mouse named Eddie. I was going to lay low and bring the jug for a while. Yeah, said Jones, don't you lose that job. If something happened to Whitey, you could fall right in there for a week or so, till they got somebody else. I guess if we're going to give a party for Doc, we gotta buy the whiskey. How much is whiskey a gallon? I don't know, said Huey. I never get more than half a pint at a time myself, at one time, that is. I figure you get a quart and right away you got friends, but you get a half pint and you can drink it in a lot before you got a lot of folks around. It's going to take dough to give Doc a party, said Mac. If we're going to give him a party at all, it ought to be a good one. Should have a big cake. I wonder when is his birthday. Don't need a birthday for a party, said Jones. No, but it's nice, said Mac. I figure it would take $10 or $12 to give Doc a party he wouldn't be ashamed of. They looked at one another speculatively. Huey suggested, The Hediondo's Cannery is hiring, guys. No, said Mac quickly. We got good reputations, and we don't want to spoil them. Every one of us keeps a job for a month or more when we take one. That's why we can always get a job when we need one. Suppose we take a job for a day or so. Why, we'll lose our reputation for sticking. Then if we needed a job, there wouldn't nobody have us. The rest nodded a quick agreement. I figure I'm going to work a couple of months. November and part of December, said Jones. Makes it nice to have some money around Christmas. We could cook a turkey this year. By God, we could, said Mac. I know a place up Carmel Valley where there's 1,500 in one flock. Valley, said Huey. You know, I used to collect stuff up in the valley for Doc. Turtles and crayfish and frogs. Got a nickel apiece for frogs. Me too, said Gay. I got 500 frogs one time. If Doc needs frogs, it's a setup, said Mac. We could go up the Carmel River and have a little outing, and we wouldn't tell Doc what it was for, and then we'd give him one hell of a party. A quick excitement grew in the palace flophouse. Gay, said Mac. Take a look out the door and see if Doc's car is in front of his place. Gay set down his glass and looked out. Not yet, he said. Well, he ought to be back any minute, said Mac. Now here's how we'll go about it. Right, Chapter 8. In April 1932, the boiler at the Hediondo Cannery blew a tube for the third time in 2 weeks, and the board of directors, consisting of Mr. Randolph and his stenographer, decided that it would be cheaper to buy a new boiler than to have to shut down so often. In time, the new boiler arrived, and the old one was moved into the vacant lot between Lee Chong's and the Bear Flag restaurant, where it was set on blocks to await an inspiration on Mr. Randolph's part on how to make some money out of it. Gradually, the plant engineer removed the tubing to use to patch other outboard equipment at the Hediondo. The boiler looked like an old-fashioned locomotive without wheels. It had a big door in the center of its nose and a low fire door. Gradually, it became red and soft with rust, and gradually the mallow weeds grew up and around it, and the flaking rust fed the weeds. Flowering myrtle crept up its side, and the wild anise perfumed the air about it. Then someone threw out a datura root, and the thick, fleshly tree grew up, and the great white bells hung down over the boiler door, and at night the flowers smelled of love and excitement, an incredibly sweet and moving odor. In 1935, Mr. and Mrs. Sam Malloy moved into the boiler. The tubing was all gone now, and it was a roomy, dry, and safe apartment. True, if you came in through the fire door, you had to get down on your hands and knees, but once in there was headroom in the middle, and you couldn't want a drier, warmer place to stay. They shagged a mattress through the fire door and settled down. Mr. Malloy was happy and contented there, and for quite a long time so was Mrs. Malloy. Below the boiler, on a hill, there were numbers of large pipes also abandoned by the Hediondo. Toward the end of 1937, there was a great catch of fish, and the canneries were working full-time, and a housing shortage occurred. Then it was that Mr. Malloy took to renting the larger pipes as sleeping quarters for single men at a very nominal fee. With a piece of tar paper over one end and a square of carpet over the other, they made comfortable bedrooms, although men used to sleeping curled up had to change their habits or move out. There were those, too, who claimed that their snores echoing back from the pipes woke them up. But on the whole, Mr. Malloy did a steady small business and was happy. Mrs. Malloy had been contented until her husband became a landlord, and then she began to change. First it was a rug, then a wash tub, then a lamp with a colored silk shade. Finally, she came into the boiler on her hands and knees one day, and she stood up and said a little breathlessly, "Holman's are having a sale of curtains. Real lace curtains in edges of blue and pink. $1.98 a set, with curtain rods thrown in." Mr. Malloy sat up on the mattress. "Curtains?" he demanded. "What in God's name do you want curtains for?" "I like nice things," said Mrs. Malloy. "I always did like to have nice things for you," and her lower lip began to tremble. "But, darling," Sam Malloy cried, "I got nothing against curtains. I like curtains." "Only $1.98, Mrs. Malloy quavered. "And you begrudge me $1.98? And she sniffed and her chest heaved. "I don't begrudge you," said Mr. Malloy. "But, darling, for Christ's sake, what are we going to do with curtains? We got no windows." Mrs. Malloy cried, and Sam held her in his arms and comforted her. "Men just don't understand how a woman feels," she sobbed. "Men just never try to put themselves in a woman's place." And Sam lay beside her and rubbed her back for a long time before she went to sleep. Okay, Chapter 9. When Doc's car came back to laboratory, Mac and the boys secretly watched Hazel help to carry in the sacks of starfish. In a few minutes, Hazel came damply up the chicken walk to the palace. His jeans were wet with seawater to the thighs, and where it was drying, the white salt rings were forming. He sat heavily in the patent rocker that was his and shucked off his wet tennis shoes. Mac asked, "How is Doc feeling?" "Fine," said Hazel. "You can't understand a word he says. Knowing what he said about stink bugs, no, I better not tell you." "He seemed in a nice friendly mood?" Mac asked. "Sure," said Hazel. "We got 300 starfish. He's all right." "I wonder if we better all go over," Mac asked himself, and he answered himself, "No, I guess it would be better if one went alone. It might get him mixed up if we all went." "What is this?" Hazel asked. "We got plans," said Mac. "I'll go myself so as not to startle him. You guys stay here and wait. I'll come back in a few minutes." Mac went out, and he teetered down the chicken walk and across the track. Mr. Malloy was sitting on a brick in front of his boiler. "How are you, Sam?" Mac asked. "Pretty good." "How's the missus?" "Pretty good," said Mr. Malloy. "You know any kind of glue that you can stick cloth to iron?" Ordinarily, Mac would have thrown himself headlong into his problem, but now he was not to be deflected. "No," he said. He went across the vacant lot, crossed the street, and entered the basement of the laboratory. Doc had his hat off now, since there were practically no chance of getting his head wet, unless a pipe broke. He was busy removing the starfish from the wet sacks and arranging them on the cool concrete floor. The starfish were twisted and knotted up, for a starfish loves to hang on to something, and for an hour these had found only each other. Doc arranged them in long lines, and very slowly they strained out until they lay in symmetrical stars on the concrete floor. Doc's pointed brown beard was damp with perspiration as he worked. He looked up a little nervously as Mac entered. It was not that trouble always came in with Mac, but something always entered with him. "Hiya, Doc," said Mac. "All right," said Doc uneasily. "Hear about Phyllis May over at the Bear Flag? She hit a drunk and got his tooth in her fist, and it's infected clear to the elbow. She showed me the tooth. It was out of a plate. Is it a false tooth poison, Doc?" "I guess everything that comes out of that human mouth is poison," said Doc warningly. "Has she got a doctor?" "The bouncer fixed her up," said Mac. I'll take her some sulfa, said Doc, and he waited for the storm to break. He knew Mac had come for something, and Mac knew he knew it. Mac said, Doc, you got any need for any kind of animals now? Doc sighed with relief. Why? He asked guardedly. Mac became open and confidential. I'll tell you, Doc, I and the boys got to get some dough. We simply got to. It's for a good purpose, you might say a worthy cause. Phyllis May's arm? Mac saw the chance, weighed it in, and gave it up. Well, no, he said. It's more important than that. You can't kill a whore. No, this is different. I and the boys thought if you needed something, we'd get it for you, and that way we could make a little piece of change. It seemed simple and innocent. Doc laid down 4 more starfish in lines. I could use 300 or 400 frogs, he said. I'd get them myself, but I've got to go down to La Jolla tonight. There's a good tide tomorrow, and I have to get some octopi. Same price for frogs? Mac asked. 5 cents apiece? Same price, said Doc. Mac was jovial. Don't you worry about frogs, Doc, he said. We'll get you all the frogs you want. You just rest easy about frogs. Why, we can get them right up Carmel River. I know a place. Good, said Doc. I'll take all you can get, but I need about 300. Just you rest easy, Doc. Don't you lose no sleep about it. You'll get your frogs, maybe 700, 800. He put the Doc at his ease about frogs, and a little cloud crossed Mac's face. Doc, he said, any chance of using your car to go up the valley? No, said Doc. I told you, I have to drive to La Jolla tonight to make tomorrow's tide. Oh, said Mac despairingly. Oh, well, don't you worry about it, Doc. Maybe we can get Lee Chong's old truck. And then his face fell a little further. Doc, he said, on a business deal like this, would you advance $2 or $3 for gasoline? I know Lee Chong won't give us gas. No, said Doc. He had fallen into this before. Once he had financed Gay to go for turtles. He financed him for 2 weeks, and at the end of that time, Gay was in jail on his wife's charge, and he never did go for turtles. Well, maybe we can't go then, said Mac sadly. Now, Doc really needed the frogs. He tried to work out some method, which was business and not philanthropy. I'll tell you what I'll do, he said. I'll give you a note to my gas station so you can get 10 gallons of gas. How will that be? Mac smiled. Fine, he said. That will work out just fine. I and the boys will get an early start tomorrow. Time you get back from the south, we'll have more damn frogs than you ever seen in your life. Doc went to the labeling desk and wrote a note to Red Williams at the gas station, authorizing the issue of 10 gallons of gasoline to Mac. Here you are, he said. Mac was smiling broadly. Doc, he said, you can get to sleep tonight and not even give frogs a thought. We'll have piss pots full of them by the time you get back. Doc watched him go a little uneasily. Doc's dealings with Mac and the boys had always been interesting, but rarely had they been profitable to Doc. He remembered rudely the time Mac sold him 15 tomcats, and by night the owners came and got every one. Mac, he had asked, why all the tomcats? Mac said, Doc, it's my own invention, but I'll tell you because you're a good friend. You make a big wire trap, and then you don't use bait. You use a lady cat. Catch every goddamn tomcat in the country that way. From the laboratory, Mac crossed the street and went through the swinging screen doors into Lee Chong's grocery. Mrs. Lee was cutting bacon on the big butcher's block. A Lee cousin primped up slightly wilted heads of lettuce the way a girl primps a loose finger wave. A cat lay asleep on the big pile of oranges. Lee Chong stood in his usual place, back of the cigar counter and in front of the liquor shelves. His tapping finger on the change mat speeded up a little when Mac came in. Mac wasted no time in sparring. Lee, he said, Doc over there's got a problem. He's got a big order for frogs from the New York Museum. Means a lot to Doc. Besides the dough, there's a lot of credit getting an order like that. Doc's got to go south, and I and the boys said we'd help him out. I think a guy's friends ought to help him out of a hole when they can, especially a nice guy like Doc. Why, I bet he spends $60, $70 a month with you. Lee Chong remained silent and watchful. His fat finger barely moved on the change mat, but it flicked slightly like a tense cat's tail. Mac plunged into his thesis. Will you let us take your old truck to go up Carmel Valley for frogs, for Doc? For good old Doc? Lee Chong smiled in triumph. Truck no good, he said. Broke down. This staggered Mac for a moment, but he recovered. He spread the order for gasoline on the cigar counter. Look, he said, Doc needs them frogs. He gave me this order for gas to get them. I can't let Doc down. Now Gay is a good mechanic. If he fixes your truck and puts it in good shape, will you let us take it? Lee put back his head so that he could see Mac through his half glasses. There didn't seem to be anything wrong with the proposition. The truck really wouldn't run. Gay really was a good mechanic, and the order for gasoline was definite evidence of good faith. "How long you be gone?" Lee asked. "Maybe half a day, maybe a whole day, just till we get the frogs." Lee was worried, but he couldn't see any way out. The dangers were all there, and Lee knew all of them. "Okay," said Lee. "Good," said Mac. "I knew Doc could depend on you. I'll get Gay right to work on that truck." He turned about to leave. "By the way," he said, "Doc's paying us 5 cents apiece for those frogs. We're going to get 700 or 800. How about taking a pint of old tennis shoes, just till we can get back with the frogs?" "No," said Lee Chong. All right, Chapter 10. Frankie began coming to Western Biological when he was just 11 years old. For a week or so, he just stood outside the basement door and looked in. Then one day, he stood inside the door. 10 days later, he was in the basement. He had very large eyes, and his hair was a dark, wiry, dirty shock. His hands were filthy. He picked up a piece of Excelsior and put it in the garbage can, and then he looked at Doc where he worked labeling specimen bottles containing purple Valella. Finally, Frankie got to the workbench, and he put his dirty fingers on the bench. It took Frankie 3 weeks to get that far, and he was ready to bolt every instant of the time. Finally, one day Doc spoke to him. "What's your name, son?" "Frankie." "Where do you live?" "Up there." A gesture up the hill. "Why aren't you in school?" "I don't go to school." "Why not?" "They don't want me there." "Your hands are dirty. Don't you ever wash?" Frankie looked stricken, and then he went to the sink and scrubbed his hands, and always afterwards he scrubbed his hands almost raw every day. And he came to the laboratory every day. It was an association without much talk. Doc, by a telephone call, established that what Frankie said was true. They didn't want him in school. He couldn't learn, and there was something a little wrong with his coordination. There was no place for him. He wasn't an idiot. He wasn't dangerous. His parents would not pay for his keep in an institution. Frankie didn't often sleep at the laboratory, but he spent his days there, and sometimes he crawled in the Excelsior crate and slept. That was probably when there was a crisis at home. Doc asked, "Why do you come here?" "You don't hit me or give me a nickel," said Frankie. "Do they hit you at home?" "There's uncles around all the time at home. Some of them hit me and tell me to get out, and some of them give me a nickel and tell me to get out." "Where's your father?" "Dead," said Frankie vaguely. "Where's your mother?" "With the uncles." Doc clipped Frankie's hair and got rid of the lice. At Lee Chong's, he got him a new pair of overalls and a striped sweater, and Frankie became his slave. "I love you," he said one afternoon. "Oh, I love you." He wanted to work in the laboratory. He swept out every day, but there was something a little wrong. He couldn't get a floor quite clean. He tried to help with grading crayfish for size. There they were in a bucket, all sizes. They were to be grouped in the big pans, laid out, all the 3-inch ones together, and all the 4-inch ones, and so forth. Frankie tried, and the perspiration stood on his forehead, but he couldn't do it. Size relationships just didn't get through to him. "No," Doc would say. "Look, Frankie, put them beside your finger like this so you'll know which ones are this long. See? This one goes from the tip of your finger to the base of your thumb. Now you just pick out another one that goes from the tip of your finger down to the same place, and it will be all right." Frankie tried, and he couldn't do it. When Doc went upstairs, Frankie crawled in the Excelsior box and didn't come out all afternoon. But Frankie was a nice, good, kind boy. He learned to light Doc's cigars, and he wanted Doc to smoke all the time so he could light the cigars. Better than anything else, Frankie loved it when there were parties upstairs in the laboratory, when girls and men gathered to sit and talk, when the great phonograph played music that throbbed in his stomach and made beautiful and huge pictures form vaguely in his head. Frankie loved it. Then he crouched down in a corner behind a chair where he was hidden and could watch and listen. When there was laughter at a joke he didn't understand, Frankie laughed delightedly behind his chair, and when the conversation dealt with abstractions, his brow furrowed and he became intense and serious. One afternoon, he did a desperate thing. There was a small party in the laboratory. Doc was in the kitchen pouring beer when Frankie appeared beside him. Frankie grabbed a glass of beer and rushed it through the door and gave it to a girl sitting in a big chair. She took the glass and said, "Why, thank you," and she smiled at him. And Doc, coming through the door, said, "Yes, Frankie, it is a great help to me." Frankie couldn't forget that. He did the thing in his mind over and over, just how he had taken the glass and just how the girl sat, and then her voice, "Why, thank you." And Doc, "A great help to me. Frankie is a great help to me. Sure, Frankie is a great help. Frankie." And oh my God, he knew a big party was coming because Doc bought steaks and a great deal of beer, and Doc let him help clean out all the upstairs. But that was nothing, for a great plan had formed in Frankie's mind, and he could just see how it would be. He went over it again and again. It was beautiful. It was perfect. Then the party started, and people came and sat in the front room, girls and young women and men. Frankie had to wait until he had the kitchen to himself and the door closed, and it was some time before he had it so. But at last he was alone, and the door was shut. He could hear the chatter of conversation and the music from the great phonograph. He worked very quietly, first a tray, then get out the glasses without breaking any. Now fill them with beer and let the foam settle a little, and then fill again. Now he was ready. He took a great breath and opened the door. The music and the talk roared around him. Frankie picked up the tray of beer and walked through the door. He knew how. He went straight toward the same young woman who had thanked him before, and then right in front of her, the thing happened. The coordination failed. The hands fumbled. The muscles panicked. The nerves telegraphed to a dead operator. The responses did not come back. Tray and beer collapsed forward into the young woman's lap. For a moment, Frankie stood still, and then he turned and ran. The room was quiet. You could hear him run downstairs and go into the cellar. They heard a hollow scrambling sound, and then silence. Doc walked quietly down the stairs and into the cellar. Frankie was in the Excelsior box, burrowed down clear to the bottom, with the pile of Excelsior on top of him. Doc could hear him whimpering there. Doc waited for a moment, and then he went quietly back upstairs. There wasn't a thing in the world he could do.